La photographie, c'est la vérité. Et le cinéma, c'est 24 fois la vérité par seconde.
These are the words of the French New Wave, a cinematic movement that sprang out of Paris in the late 1950s as a response to the radical social changes that emerged in France following the end of the Second World War. But what do these words mean to the people who put them in their films, and to us looking back on them now? In 1946, following the liberation of France and the end of Nazi occupation, the French Prime Minister, Léon Blum, travelled to Washington DC to negotiate an agreement with the American Secretary of State, James Byrne. One of the major results of the Blum-Burns agreement was the lifting of a Nazi-imposed ban on non-Axis films on the occupied territory. The result of this was a huge influx of American cultural products, especially films. The growth of the foreign film market following the lifting of the ban created a feverish love of cinema experienced by young people who had never seen films like these before. Works by directors from all around the world came into vogue as the cinephilia gripped the post-war generation. At the heart of this cinephilia were a group of young moviegoers who would go on to become some of French cinema's most vocal critics, as well as its most prolific contributors. After years of watching and critiquing films at local clubs, an influential theorist called André Bazin would co-found a film journal called Cahiers du Cinéma in 1951. This journal would go on to be key in the founding of the ideas of the French New Wave, and reflected the climate of cultural celebration that followed years of social and political repression France had experienced during the occupation. Offering previously unknown images of other parts of the world and their culture, the clubs also helped inform the idea that cinema was more than just a form of popular entertainment. For the passionate moviegoers, it was also an art movement. It was around this time that the journalists began referring to this post-war generation as La Nouvelle Vague, or the New Wave. Although this term was originally used to refer to this generation in a broader sociological sense, it would go on to describe its most famous cultural landmark, film. It was into this culture of cinephilia the writers of Cahiers du Cinéma would talk passionately about the works of directors such as Alfred Hitchcock, Orson Welles, Michelangelo Antonioni, and Federico Fellini. From their love of these directors' singular works, Bazin developed La politique des auteurs, or auteur theory. This is the idea that a film is the work of a single author who controls every aspect of the film they make, and it's their singular vision that we see in the final cut. Although there are other roles in creating film, it is the director who has the control, who uses their camera like a painter uses their brush to create a final product. At the time critic and future New Wave director Alexander Ostrich coined this idea in his essay The Birth of a New Avant-Garde, where he talks of a camera stylo or camera pen. This is what gives a director their own style of cinematography, mise-en-scène, sound and editing. In this essay, Ostrich believed that the camera stylo would help break cinema free of its enslavement to image for its own sake, from the immediate and concrete demands of the narrative, and would become a means of expressing philosophical meditations on human production, psychology, metaphysics, ideas and passions. By the mid-1950s, many of the future key directors of the New Wave were writing for Cahiers du Cinéma, penning pieces on film theory and reviewing new films. The writers at Cahiers started to come up with a list of principles of auteur theory, which would become the defining features of the New Wave films. These included a realism of the mise-en-scène, which meant that all the films were shot on site using natural lighting and unknown actors. This was partly due to the low budget of their films, but also helped provide an objective view of the stories they were making. The most influential of these writers were a group that came to be known as the Young Turks. This group included Jean-Luc Godard, François Truffaut, Jacques Rivette and Claude Chabrol. This group of young critics came to be revered as well as feared in film circles for their passionately written pieces on film theory before any of them even began making films. The most well-known of the group was François Truffaut, who gained notoriety after he wrote a piece published in Cahiers in 1954 called A Certain Tendency of the French Cinema. In this essay, he put forth a scathing attack on French cinema's tradition of quality and the proliferation of movie adaptations of literary novels mimicking the traditional Hollywood style. The article was a direct attack to the bourgeois left's ideas of grand moralism represented in their films, and earned the writers of Cahiers rumours of right-wing and even fascist sympathies that would haunt many of them through their directorial careers. After its publication, Cahiers du Cinéma faced backlash from the French cinematic establishment, especially due to Truffaut's specific attacks on two of the establishment's most respected directors, Jean Orange and Pierre Prost. 4 years after its publication, A Certain Tendency and a series of brutal, unforgiving reviews released in Cahiers, Truffaut had nicknamed the Gravedigger of French cinema and was even banned from Cannes Film Festival in 1958. Just a year later, Truffaut released his first feature film, The 400 Blows. The film gained significant attention due to his fame as a critic, but was also an immediate success both popularly and critically. The film was a semi-autobiographical story about a young boy struggling through his troubled adolescence due to his rebellious nature. It came to be a defining film of the New Wave and even saw Truffaut return to Cannes, shocking audiences and critics when he took home the prize for Best Director. After the release of The 400 Blows, the other Young Turks began releasing films following the philosophy of auteur theory. What was possibly the most influential of the New Wave films was Jean-Luc Godard's debut film, Breathless, released in 1960, just 1 year after The 400 Blows. Godard's film gained attention due to his unconventional use of jump cuts, sound editing, and rambling story arc, and came to sum up the major tenets of the Nouvelle Vague perhaps more than any other piece of work of the movement. Just like many of the Wave's other films, the strange new editing and directing weren't just for their own sake. They showed that the traditional methods followed until then weren't the only way. Godard even said of his own film, "There used to be just one way. That was one way you could do things. There were people who protected it like a copyright, a secret cult only for the initiated. That's why I don't regret making Breathless and blowing all that apart." The style of the New Wave constantly reminded audiences that they were watching a film. It was typical of their features to use strange editing techniques to place the audience back in their seat. Godard in particular was known for his style of editing on action. Or even on to dialogue.
C'est interdit d'aller voir ce type. Hélas, hélas, hélas. J'aime une fille qui a une très jolie nuque, de très jolis seins, une très jolie voix, de très jolis poignets, un très joli front, de très jolis genoux. Mais qui est lâche.
The New Wave became famous for its prolific use of mismatching jump cuts, turning their back like they did with so many other things on the traditional Hollywood style of matching cuts to make their editing invisible. This also had the effect of speeding up the pacing of their films, and those of the directors they would go on to inspire. Other typical features of the New Wave was the camera work. The use of a moving camera was a relatively new concept in cinema by this time, with many established directors preferring steady fixed shots over the use of pans or even free cameras. The directors of the New Wave more than anything else wanted their films to be noticed, and deployed these methods to great effect just to show that they could. It wasn't unusual for a character to look directly at the camera, breaking the fourth wall. Or even to refer directly to the audience.
Vous voyez, elle pense qu'à rigoler.
À qui tu parles?
Aux spectateurs.
So what did the French New Wave achieve for its rejection of mainstream methods and pioneering of their own? If we look at an essay written by André Bazin called The Ontology of the Photographic Image, we can see the beginnings of the meditations on film that started at the end of the Second World War all the way through to the very first of the New Wave films in the late 1950s. In her retrospective on the New Wave, Naomi Green stated that the essay, in exploring the fundamental issues, Bazin draws not on earlier film theories, but rather on two important thinkers of the post-war generation, that is, Jean-Paul Sartre and André Malraux. This is significant because it suggests that, according to Bazin, photography represents a new stage in artistic realism because it relies solely on the mechanical means to reproduce reality, unlike, for example, painting. It was this new approach to look at cinema as an art form to represent truth through style that became important in the movements following the New Wave. This is what Godard showed when he wrote those lines in The Small Soldier. For him and many of La Nouvelle Vague, cinema was the perfect medium to represent the truths of their generation. The directors of the New Wave didn't want to replace the methods of their predecessors, they wanted to add to them, to create films that represented the thoughts and experiences of those who watched them. Although the movement was short-lived, it had a huge effect on modern cinema. It proved that great award-winning films could be made outside the establishment, with relatively little money and no formal training. The New Wave would go on to inspire modern auteurs such as Martin Scorsese, Quentin Tarantino, Robert Altman, as well as hundreds of directors outside of Hollywood. But most of all, they made cinema fun again.